to start. The technical issue started, as it always happens. Good afternoon, guests, and to the beautiful young people here. Welcome, you're very welcome. This is your first step into this institution called Nelson Mandela University. My name is Nomalanga Mkhize, and I am the Director of School for the School of Governmental and Social Sciences. That's a very long name, but not very complicated. In our school, we have history, anthropology, political science, philosophy, and all the hardcore humanities subjects like that. Now, today, of course, then we are in a very good position to be part of this event in which we are going to be discussing the land question in South Africa. Now, for most people here, I think we know there's really only two ways to deal with the land question in South Africa. It's either we deal with it directly or we deal with it by proxy. By that we mean either we're going to go into the land question and actually attend to it, or we're going to try to solve it by doing other things, which maybe have nothing to do with land, but that we think will make people happy. It's clear that in South Africa, we've tried to do the land question in both ways, and we are struggling. So today's event is really about getting that issue on the table, especially now when it seems as if we have made no more progress. Can I call our beautiful entertainer onto the stage? Thank you. So before we get into difficult issues, we are very blessed and very fortunate to have this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful band here with us that is led by the amazing Dumza Maswana. And we're going to really get into the program perhaps from a spiritual angle, not just from our intellectual angle. I'm going to read a brief bio before I invite him onto the stage and you give him a huge round of applause. Dumza Maswana is a South African artist well known for the singular depth of his soothing baritone voice. He fuses tradition, spiritual, and jazz to create sonic experiences that uplift, inspire, and heal. Dumza writes and sings from a place of knowing, reflecting all that he has experienced and paying homage to his culture and the music that inspires him. Dumza's artistry has landed him on global stages, including those at the Edinburgh Festival in Scotland, where he was accompanied by the Mansi Musical Ensemble and performed at Sing Festival in Toronto, Canada. Locally, he has graced the Grahamstown National Arts Festival and Makufe Festival, Ebubeleni Festival, and Buyelekhaya Festival stages. With that, please give a beautiful round of applause to our artist.
Kwathi-ke ke lokungantsomi xhosi kungaphumi impondo. Kwakukho intombazanana egama linguma India isiqushuqushu sesiqova esinezigweqe umzukulwana kaMambanjwa. Le ntombazana iphuma kugombo ze ithi rhoqo ngeholide zehlobo mhlawumbe zobusika ityelele umakhulu wayo uMambanjwa kwiilali zasebhirha engqushwa. Wayemyala rhoqo ke umakhulu wakhe athi, noma India mntanam uze undincede ungake ulinge udlalele kude nekhaya ngakumbi kwezilali zingaphesheya. Kukuba ngenye imini nathi nidlala igcwala imifula ningakwazi ukuwela. Oh noma India athi qhuzu etyoba ilihlo. Minazana ithile kwilale ngaphesheya kwatyuwa edindala. Kwabakho umgidi kwaxhelwa wena zibhokhwe zigusha zinkomo ngokwamabhongo akhona. Oh abantwana benomdla babaleka ukuya emgidini abanemitsi babaleka beqabela ngaphesheya. Nasoke nesiqushuqushu esinezigweqe umzukulwana kaMambanjwa ewela ngaphesheya. Oh ingathi ndiyabona uMambanjwa izibuzo kokuba iphi le ntombazana. Kanti intombazana kumnandi kuyo kwamlebese imunca intupha kumnandi nabanye abantwana ngaphesheya. Kwathi ke kusenjalo kumnandi kudlalwa kutyiwa kuncithwancithwana. Yasibekela imozulu. kwatsho isiphangokazi ezingazange sabonwa. Kananjalo abantwana banemitsi baye babaleka ukuwela ngaphesheya phambi kokuba ugcwale umfula. Naso ke nesiqushuqushu esinezigweqe emzulu ngamambanjwa siyinsiza. Safika umfula ugcwele. Wathi xa efika wabeka unyawo lwakhe lokuqala, wabeka olwesibini, wathi xa ibeka olwesithathu amtshayela amandla umsinga unoma India. Oh, umambanjwa wayihamba ebuzisa ngayo kokuba khe nambona namntwanam, khe nambona namzukulwana wam. Abangaye kulo athi hayi mna bendimgqibele, hayi mna bendimgqibele. Kwahlwa kwasa unoma India, akukho mntu maziyo ukuba uphina. Kanti unoma India wasinda, waginywa lisele. Sele eloke lalihamba licula libuzisa ngayo kokuba niyamazi nalo ndimthweleyo. Lalicula ke isele ingoma ethi kamini kanchi ndiphethe umaYindia, kamini kanchi ndiphethe umhloba segombo, kamini kanchi, kamini kanchi ndiphethe umaYindia, kamini kanchi, gombo we sakugqibezela ngenye imini kuhlwile nisekhona endlwini. Igama lam nguDumza kuMaswana. Okay, you can clap with lokuthana abantu yasebeyoyika namhlanje. Please be kind to us, smile at us. Ngeke wonke umuntu ubambekile tonight. Be kind to us. We're going to return that energy. Thank you so much. On bass, Elviro Fruolek. On drums, Sakino Mbozolo. On alto sax, Karabo Mdlong. On trumpet, Kurt Ricks. And on piano, Mtogozi Samabuza. And the next song, Kudala. Lomatafa by Mamos Bongile Kumalo. Madola diniwe dibe ditunywe umama no tata ndifu numdakwethu kulomatafa andi fumani dinyu kindaba dikwese mifula dikweza induli dicanda matafa ema satini konzakele ali fumani dobheka phinda dotshona phi ukuze ndibe nombona bantu ncedani nindixelele ngomntakwethu Tamse. Yes, sir. Dobheka phi dotsho naphi ukuze ndibe nombona bantu ncedani indixelele ngomntakwethu awunangomo wayihlinzaphi le ngomo 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 wayihlinzaphi. Thank you. Yeah, so last week I was in Joburg, and when I left, my voice could sing some notes, and when I came back, I think they bewitched me there. To those who've seen me before performing, just know that something happened in Joburg. So I asked the guys to do this beautiful piece by Dr. Jonas Gwangwa, Flowers of the Nation, as our last this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful spiritual opening to our event. And thank you to Budumza for honoring one of our greats. With that, we can move along, and I would like to welcome our Acting Vice Chancellor, Professor Andre Kiet, who will do the welcoming and the protocol.
I am a child of South Africa. I am born in, raised, nurtured, and protected by South Africa and her people. And to South Africa, her people, leaders, and national values, I am loyal. Not knowing whether ridicule, imprisonment, or death await me, I am entitled to carry out my inalienable duties and responsibilities in pursuit of the current and future rights, privileges, and benefits of the men, women, and children of this beloved country. Upon these values, I invoke the courage to respond to the pleas of all my fellow citizens, for me to join them in the fight for and pursuit of our national values. These are the values that bind me to past and future South African souls. His Majesty the King of the Nkunkwa Kingdom, King Haakon VI, the Raymond and Dideka Mhlaba family, Prof. Levine, Denise Kusana, Ngobi Gubani, Amakawe Yetu Foundation Kubecha, Nelson Mandela University Council members, our Deputy Chair is here, Senior Management, Faculty Management, students and student leadership, Minister Senzo Ndlovu of the St. John's Methodist Church and other ecumenical leaders present, research associates of the Raymond Mhlaba Center for Governance and Leadership, learners from Tandukolo High School, KwaZulu-Natal High School, Kamagake High School, Izikabeni High School, Chapman High School, and Pearson High School, representatives from Vierplaas and Shortable ratepayers and civil society organizations, distinguished guests, colleagues, and community members here and online. On behalf of our Vice Chancellor, Prof. Sibongile Mutwa, it is my great honor to welcome you to the 2024 Raymond Mhlaba Institutional Public Lecture focusing on the land question and labor tenancy in South Africa. Unequal access to land affects negatively the extent of substantive democratization in our country, despite our standing as a consolidated democracy when measured in procedural indicators. At our university, we believe that addressing the deep-rooted challenges of land reform is a moral imperative we must realize in our lifetime. We are aware of our geographical and historical positioning in the Eastern Cape, a region intensely linked to the legacies of land disposition and colonial rule. It is our responsibility as an institution named after one of the greatest champions of justice, Nelson Mandela, with a center named after Umre, to enable the correction of these historical wrongs. The poem, The Patriot, by Motshagomo Papu Nkoli, which I cited earlier when I started off with my welcoming remarks, in word and soul connects with the life of Umre and the values he held dear. For this very reason, and in the context of this lecture, labor tenancy is a reminder of the ongoing struggles that many South Africans continue to face. Millions of people are still directly affected by insecure land tenure, particularly on farms, as our studies have shown. These individuals, in the main, are labor tenants, and despite efforts to address their plight, reports show that a small fraction of claims made under the Land Reform Act of 1996 have been successfully resolved. This underscores the urgent need for continued action and engagement on this critical issue. Today, we are privileged to have Professor Richard Levine and our two respondents as people that will engage with this crucial question. Prof. Levine, your work has been instrumental in shedding light on the complexities of land disposition. Your presence here today offers us a priceless opportunity to engage with these realities, not just as abstract concepts, but as lived experiences that affect the lives of countless South Africans. We look forward to your reflections and the critical discussions that will follow by our respondents and the Q&A as we seek to better understand the path towards meaningful land reform and justice. Many thanks for joining us. Please give a hand to Prof. Levine, please. Our university is committed to being part of this journey. We recognize that land insecurity affects communities across the country, from the Amamfango in the Tsitsikamma and all those who identify as First Nations, Indigenous, and African people from across our country and region, to those in the Western Cape who continue to face evictions from farms. These stories remind us that land reform is not just a distant policy issue, it is a lived reality for many, and it is our duty to engage with these stories, to retrace the steps of history, and to imagine a future where justice prevails. Prof. Levine, we are also aware of your work with the University of Johannesburg in training state officials to handle land claims more effectively. Here at our university, we share a similar commitment to equipping not only state officials, but also land beneficiaries with the skills and knowledge to navigate the complexities of land reform. We welcome any opportunity for collaboration and stand ready to contribute our expertise in this critical field. The connections to the land that stretches across generations must be honored as we seek solutions that are inclusive and respectful of all of those who call this land and country home. I would like to thank the leadership of our university for their commitment to creating spaces for these important conversations. Special thanks, of course, to the Mhlaba family and, of course, the Faculty of Humanities and the Raymond Mhlaba Center for Governance and Leadership. It is through engagement like this that we can truly live up to the legacies of our struggle icons who believe that dialogue and justice are key to building a better future for all. To all of you here today and online, thank you for your participation and presence. Let us approach today's lecture with an open mind and a sense of purpose, knowing that the work that we do here is part of a larger effort to build a South Africa where justice and equality are not just ideals, but palpable realities. Thank you very much. You are warmly welcomed.
Thank you for that, Acting Vice-Chancellor. I do plan to be a very efficient program director today, so hopefully things will move quite swiftly. With that, I would like to invite a family representative from the Mhlaba family and to remind everybody that this lecture is in the memory and to honor our stalwart, the late Premier and activist Omre. So with that, welcome family.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the institution to invite us as a family. I'm not a descendant of the Raymond Mhlaba family direct. I'm the family through politics, through the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and SANCO and other community movements which we served in the struggle. I forget sometimes I'm getting old. The Master of Ceremony, the Khoi and Son leadership, our family of Omre, the leadership of this institution, the leadership of the university, which is named after a very, very dynamic and great leader of the 20th century. Umre, Mbeki, Mandela, and others were true angels. They are men and women of honor. To us, when we saw Umre landing at the airport, Stearman Airport, we wanted to see the man with the white head. When he appeared on the plane as it was disembarking, we showed shocked and thrilled by this tall, strong man. I would like to dedicate this support to the institution and the university to the people of Gaza. Because Umre, I'm sure, if he was still alive, he would talk about Gaza. But the struggle of Gaza is a struggle for land. The Zionist regime under the US, NATO, are continuing to to oppress the people of Gaza, the Palestine. They call them animals. We're shocked that in the 21st century, with artificial intelligence and the rest, we could publicly do what you are doing in public in Gaza. It is totally not acceptable. Today, the institution and the university is involved in a lot of issues in the township where I come from, in PE or Kabeka. They are involved in food security, gardens. You will be shocked what this university is doing, which is not much appearing in the newspapers today. But when you read the newspaper today, you see all the negative issues about boycotts and other issues. They are involved in training the youth, empowering the young people. I would like to start with the light moments of Umre, because I was always carrying his bag as he was going around the country and in the province doing politicking. One of the first moments, when Christian was going to come here in 1992 in PE, we have to raise funds. And Umre led a team of us to meet the VW CEO. And the CEO, after discussion with him, Umre said, I would like to see the plant and talk to the workers. And we talked to the workers, and into the meeting, Umre said, I want money for the Communist Party. Christian is coming here. And the CEO said, he's a German guy, Umre, I'll give you the money, but if Christian has to address me, he must pay me to address me. So he gave us money, and Umre was successful in that. The other one was that when he was freed, the first day Umre was freed, at 12 o'clock he landed in PE, at 3 o'clock to fly back to Joburg. He said, Umre, you're not going to even spend a day at your home. He said, no, I'm being called by Mhlaba and Mandela to go and discuss critical matters in Joburg. The other matter we should know, Umgob and Umre, they were close friends. But Umgob was 10 years older than Umre. So he used to say, Poti, Ray, Put Govern. When they came out, we got a car from VW. And when we used to drive them around, at 12 o'clock, exactly at 12, they will leave the office of the ANC to go have lunch. And Umgob will always say, Ray, let's go to the sea, at the beach, Pollock Beach or any strand beach there. And then Umre was annoyed about this. He said, Governor Becky, we have been in Robaland for more than 20 years. Why do you want to go to the sea? We own the sea. Then this thing continued again, and then Umre said to Governor, please, Governor, why don't you buy a house next to the sea in Summerstrand? And then Umgob bought a house in Summerstrand, and Umre followed. The last thing which I would like to say with Raymond, we went to Raymond to talk to the religious leaders about the ANC, the Communist Party. And after finishing, we went to one of the houses to have lunch. And unfortunately, as we were going to leave, Umre wanted to go to the small house, right? When he went to the house, there was no toilet paper there. And then we left Umre, they went to try and find something. Then we found Umre leaving the small house. Then as we were driving, Umre, how did you solve that problem? He said, no, I multitask. I've sorted my problem there. Umre is one of the guys who said, when there were deadlocks in Kotesa, let's bring in Kachabutelezi into the negotiation table. Now let's go to his policies. You can see this is a man who was so humble. Him and Umgob were totally different people. This one was humble like any other thing. I think this topic today is very, very relevant to his passion. That fundamentally the struggle for freedom, for social, political, and economic emancipation is a struggle for land, finish and clear. We don't live in the sky. We don't live in the sky. We don't live in the sea. We live on land. Section 25 of the Constitution talks about land rights, talks about, and many other things. That's why our movement, the ANC, blundered in the last 30 years, because it didn't address the fundamentals. What is in the land? The minerals and everything, food. That's why there's poverty. More than 50% of our people are getting grants. We're the highest country in the world that is divided between the rich and the poor. I won't talk about, I think Prof. Levin will talk beautifully about the land issues in the world. But our family, both politically and biologically, is very happy and thankful for the varsity and the institution for keeping the flag of Ombre flying high and here. Lastly, people who are very quiet in South Africa, in Port Elizabeth, Gqeberha, about the murderous working. Don't sleep when you look at Al Jazeera. We look all, how can the Zionist devils kill children? Up to 45,000 people, more than 60% are kids. Are they Hamas? If they can do this in public, what are they doing in hiding? So in those few words, I wish the institution a successful program, and we are really grateful with the intellectual work we are doing in developing leaders, the youth in particular in this country. I want to talk about the GNU and land. Thank you very much.
Inkosi kakhulu tata. Nyalo ke sitakwethula sikhulumi sethu sanamhlanje. Ukhuluma siswati ke professor sitomethula ngesiswati. We will introduce you, you will give your keynote, and then thereafter I will invite you and the respondents to come to the stage. Professor Levine is a visiting professor at Nelson Mandela University and the University of the Witwatersrand. He has published on land reform, the state and public administration in South Africa and internationally. He has occupied numerous leading roles in South Africa since 1997, and he is currently the Special Master, Labor Tenants, and former Director General at the Department of Public Service and Administration in 2004 and again in 2018. And with that brief CV that does not tell us all your achievements, Babe, siyakwemukela.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Acting Vice Chancellor, for this wonderful opportunity. It is a great honor that I come and talk in the name of Raymond Mhlaba. I don't take that lightly at all. I really appreciate that. What I do now, as has been mentioned, is I'm the Special Master of Labor Tenants, a position which was created through the Constitutional Court following a protracted litigation wherein labor tenants themselves, supported by an NGO, AFRA, in Pietermaritzburg, launched a class action suit against the government, the Department of Land Affairs, for its failures to address the legislative requirements of the Labor Tenants Act. And this is what I found. In 1998, on a farm called Velverdient in Dumbe, KwaZulu-Natal, 2 years after the promulgation of the Land Reform Labor Tenants Act, 9 families of labor tenants alleged that they were given a month's notice before they were compelled to relocate to a barren, rocky part of the farm situated at the foot of the mountain. There was no court order to effect the relocation as required by Section 8 of the Act. The relocation was characterized by subterfuge aimed at dressing up the illegal relocation in a garb of legality. A fraudulent relocation agreement was framed 3 years after the forced removal by the farm owner and signed by 6 labor tenants, as well as the farmer, and witnessed by 2 state officials from the Department of Land Affairs. The labor tenant who revealed the fraudulent document had been told that it was a title deed issued against the land that they had been relocated to. The forced removal was a violation of the labor tenant's constitutional and human rights. Young men who appeared vocal and challenged the abuse being meted out to the community were targeted with and dealt with ruthlessly. Tulani Mkhwanazi, now 54 years old, was around 27 when this abuse occurred. This is his testimony. At first, we resisted the relocation. That is when I received a major beating for being recalcitrant. I was assaulted and dragged by a motor vehicle. I was beaten up with a sjambok till it broke into pieces. Luther, the farm owner, beat me up. He went to inform his mother in town, and she said I should not be taken to a doctor for fear of the arrest of her son because I had been severely assaulted. I was naked and couldn't wear clothes. My clothes got stuck to my lacerated body. He beat me up for nothing. He tried to force me to admit that his cattle were poisoned by my father. How could have one done this? His cattle entered the fields to graze soon after insecticide spraying had taken place. But then I was falsely accused to take responsibility. He, the farm owner, took me and drove off far into the belly of the timber plantation, where he pointed a gun at my forehead. He said, "Did anyone see me driving off with you?" I said, "The trees saw me." He responded and said, "Do trees speak? If I were to kill you now, who would know that I'd killed you here?" He then dragged me into his car and drove back with me to the farm and put me into a shed and oiled my body with grease. He tied me to a pole outside, and his dog bit my hands. He threw a sack on top of my body, the same sack on which his dog slept. That is all I had as a blanket throughout the night till the next morning. I sat outside, tied to a pole. The following morning he took me home and laid me down. He took his gun out of the car and pointed at me. He continued beating me up. At that point, I still did not know the reason for being assaulted. He continued till he was satisfied. I told him to rather kill me because he was making false accusations against me. He then locked me up in a shed until I recovered. He didn't allow me to go home, and he assaulted me every day. He broke my teeth. This brutal forced removal, unfortunately, is not exceptional, and is part of the ethnic cleansing process initiated by the colonization and settlement of South Africa by Dutch and later British colonial forces. This settlement ignited a series of land wars that led to the genocide of the San and the conquest and subjugation of the Khoi, Xhosa, Zulu, Ndebele, Tsonga, Shangaan, Northern Sotho, Botswana, Southern Sotho, and Venda-speaking peoples across the length and breadth of the borders of the Republic of South Africa. Those borders, of course, were defined by the colonial settlement of another land war between the British and the Boers at the beginning of the 20th century. The nucleus of the Botswana, Swazi, and Basotho remained under British protectorates, while most of their peoples remained within the borders of South Africa. The preamble of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa asks South Africans to heal the divisions of the past while improving the quality of life of all citizens and freeing the human capabilities and potential of each person. I wonder what Thulani Mkhwanazi said about that, for that beating took place in 1998, 2 years after the adoption of the new Constitution. The Bill of Rights seeks to achieve the progressive realization of socio-economic rights, including fostering conditions which enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis through the expropriation of land in terms of law of general application in the public interest. This public interest includes the nation's commitment to land reform. The Bill of Rights establishes the democratic state on the values of human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. The rights of labor tenants are protected by the Constitution and the Act, but the government was unable to deliver the constitutional promise of land reform in terms of the Act, leading to a class action lawsuit that brought about the appointment of a special master through the Mhlaba case. The work of the special master has been hampered by bureaucratic rigmarole, a lack of resources, but a method has been developed in line with Rule 40 and 41 of the Land Claims Court and Section 37 of the Act to provide evidence and proof of labor tenancy in terms of the provisions of the legislation, and to track historically the extent of land that labor tenants had access to through geospatial analysis. Land is the central demand of labor tenant applicants, who are now aging and growing increasingly anxious about the prospects of achieving their land rights in their lifetimes. This talk examines the political economy of land reform in South Africa, assessing the balance of forces in the current conjuncture that shape the prospects for meaningful land reform for labor tenants, and the social relations of production that built capitalist agriculture in South Africa today. South Africa is a particular form of a settler colony. It has been described as colonialism of a special type within liberal, national liberatory, and socialist discourses. The fact is that the arrival of Dutch settlers in the Cape in 1652 sparked a series of land wars between settlers and indigenous South Africans, leading to the genocide of the San. The European settlers waged war against the Khoi and the Xhosa in the Cape, before conflict between Dutch and the British led to further expansion of Boer settlers and the British, later engulfing the entire subcontinent in a series of bitter land wars. This is irrefutable, as is the assertion that South Africa is a form of settler colony and society shaped by the expropriation of the land of indigenous people. These South African land wars reflect global land wars, whose form may well have been shaped in the more recent history by capitalism, but whose genesis reflects an interpenetration of various modes of production, African and European, that preceded capitalism. Western philosophers over many historical epochs and centuries argued that social inequality is inevitable and destined by fate to divide societies into social categories of landowners and commoners. Plato advocated land should be held in common, while Aristotle favored private property. Monarchs and the nobility across the globe preferred oppressive control to generosity, and the history of the Assyrian Empire provides early examples of displacement as a technique of control and intimidation of their colonial subjects. The extreme modern example is indeed the State of Israel, where Zionism, from the onset of its history as an independent polity, Israel in 1948 and in the decades prior adopted a strategy of displacement and intimidation to expel and displace Palestinians from their land, resulting in the now globally acknowledged genocide and ethnic cleansing. This land war continues to unfold in front of our eyes, as we've heard, as we sit here this afternoon. Ironically, Jewish law in biblical times mandated a jubilee, a forgiveness of debt that Jesus Christ stated as a pledge to the poor who would be blessed and inherit the earth in return for their obedience. During the European Middle Ages, exile, expulsion, and banishment once again became a tool of domination, control, and oppression, as hundreds of thousands of people, mainly Muslims and Jews, were expelled from their lands, irrespective of property rights and traditions of spiritual compassion. During more recent centuries, eviction and displacement increased and intensified in scale and volume as feudal landlords deployed forced enclosures as a strategy to control the commons and the forests. The history of the expropriation of the serf, peasant, and worker from their means of production in land during the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe is described by Karl Marx as having been recorded in the annals of the history of human society and having been written in letters of fire and blood. The fire and blood expressed itself in the defense of peasants in early modern Europe of their right to occupancy of the land they lived and worked on. The Magna Carta in 1215 limited the power of the English king and established the rule of law. The Charter of the Forest in 2017 asserted the rights to field and forest of a European peasantry determined to defend their rights of occupancy in land struggles that at times became quite violent. These rights and values were ultimately inscribed within the Constitution of the United States of America and became the benchmark for many existing and emerging nations. It was in the late 17th century, with enclosures becoming rampant, that the philosopher John Locke articulated a theory that argued that individual labor on land formed the basis of property, and that property rights, rather than loyalty to the crown, constituted the basis of modern states. English evolving law recognized the right to be protected against displacement and the right to hold land in common. Enlightened European monarchs redistributed land to stifle aristocratic power and secure their own sovereignty. During the French Revolution, peasants expropriated the land of aristocrats in the name of the state. And in the following century, reforms in Sweden and Russia redistributed land through legal frameworks that made 2/3 of farmers owners by the 1920s. The theoretical foundations of these developments were also influenced by John Stuart Mill's 1857 publication of The Principles of Political Economy, where King Frederick II of Prussia was praised for having redistributed land from aristocrats to rich peasants. These various historical analyses were generalized by other thinkers and scholars to the colonized world, and examples from North America were used to bolster arguments in favor of formal property ownership. In many instances, this worked in favor of exiles from land enclosures in Europe, because many of the settlers that first settled places like the United States, North America as a whole, even Latin America, as well as Asia and Australia, were actually exiled. And the extreme example is Asia, where the original settlers who committed genocide against the Aboriginal people were prisoners who were exiled in order to become settlers and landowners and lords in their country of settlement. The Homestead Act in the United States was the one that allowed these settlers to gain vast tracts of land and use slave labor to develop that land. And of course, before slave labor came, and during the period of slave labor, the Native Americans were also subject to displacement, intimidation, and genocide. European colonizers, however, prevented native subjects from owning land, with the right to occupy or inherit land being tempered by racism. This you can see in Haiti, where African slaves and their descendants worked the land already flowing with the blood of native populations subjected by the French to destruction through genocide. News of the French Revolution led to an explosion of resistance in 1974, as slaves revolted against the French colonizers and after a decade-long struggle, Haiti declared its national independence, with the victors of the struggle, the sons and daughters of African slaves, intent on redistributing land. But here the French demanded compensation, claiming it's them who had displaced the Native American or Haitian population, and therefore they had conquered the land and put it to productive use. So now the French declared ownership over that land, which the indigenous inhabitants could not claim because they had died off, while the former slave masters should be compensated for their losses. The first president, Alexandre Pétion, agreed to pay because no state was willing to trade with Haiti. And the only way for the embargo to end was for the new Haitian state to pay compensation to the French, and all the money and resources they would have had to build infrastructure was taken away from them. And so Haiti remains an impoverished country to this day, which talks about the racism involved in all these land wars and colonial conquests which continue to haunt this country. Perhaps the importance of the Haitian experience lies in understanding the significance of land expropriation in the 18th and 19th century settler colonies like the United States, Canada, or Australia. Because where indigenous occupancy rights were terminated there through genocide, what happened is that they got ownership of the land, which didn't happen in Haiti. Why? Farming in Ireland and India was characterized by a high level of occupancy, where the peasants did not own the land. But they were required to pay rents and taxes, and this placed great strain on those indigenous occupiers, the Irish and the Indians. Seasonal fluctuations made it difficult for peasants in India and Ireland to meet the demands of colonial rents. Against this background, struggles for the right to occupy shaped peasant revolts in the latter half of the 19th century. These struggles demanded land to the tiller, and that those who occupied land should have a right to remain there. In the case of Ireland, this led to a protracted land war, which Irish politicians argued could only be resolved through land redistribution. The Irish land war lasted about 7 years, and a battery of laws was then introduced, including the introduction of land courts to secure rent control and measures designed to entitle tenants to purchase their right to land from landlords. Landlords were compensated at market value for their losses in land, and most departed for greener pastures in California. So the Irish landowners ran away to California and became the richest of them all. So, the Irish model has been depicted as an aristocrat's truce with an anti-colonial rebellion. And it's been a model. It's been a model. So if one goes through some of the other developments where the whole terminology of land reform began to enter the discourse, you can look, for example, at the policies of colonial Britain, which imposed white settlers on Kenya and Tanzania while displacing indigenous populations. Indeed, the seeds of the Israeli-Palestine conflict were also sown around this time, when the Zionist movement declared that the Jewish people would be reclaiming their ancient and holy land rights. In these early 20th century initiatives, repatriations for one community implied the displacement of another. In the aftermath of World War II, America promoted land redistribution in Japan and Korea as a weapon to fight communism, and Japanese and Korean landlords were compensated for their land by the Americans. So land reform was increasingly actually seen as a bulwark against communism and a pathway to prosperity, economic development by Western ideologues. This new area of scholarship was also influenced by the work of anti-colonial intellectuals in India and Ireland. And in the post-World War II era, many congregated at Rome at the Food and Agricultural Organization. And this saw this whole new discipline of land redistribution. So land redistribution is not that radical as it's made out to be at all. It's part of colonial and neo-colonial and post-colonial ways of life. And it's been funded, as we see, by the Americans. And those states created land reform. The Americans paid off landowners. The peasants then entered productive agriculture. An internal market was created for industrialization, and so Korea and Japan bloomed and exploded. And today we have the Samsungs of the world, which dominate each and every one of us, probably most of us sitting in this hall, including myself. So basically, we had in these various struggles that continued around the globe issues like land to the tiller, and often the land did go to the tiller. But in South Africa, no, not yet. Not yet. But it was actually the unendurable oppression in the former Russia and the Soviet Union as it became, as well as China and Cuba, which led to seizure of land without compensation. And that's another irrefutable fact. I've mentioned others already. So, to move back to South Africa, where land and agrarian relations were built on genocide and colonial conquests and ethnic cleansing, and as we will see, the ongoing ethnic cleansing, when we look at the numbers post-apartheid of evictions from historical white-owned land. So, the various laws that were passed during the colonial period in what was to become the 4 colonies, Cape, Natal, Orange Free State, and Transvaal, all lent into this kind of ideology and law that prevented the possibility of black people owning land in their own country. So the bitter conflict between Britain and English settlers on the one hand, and Dutch settlers now with a distinct identity as Boers and Afrikaners on the other hand, culminated in the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 and 1902. The British were victorious, but the two sides very quickly found common course in establishing the Union of South Africa in 1910. And then came the 1913 Land Act, the 1936 Native Trust and Land Act, confining the majority of blacks in rural areas to 7% and 13% of the land, respectively, to become both subjects of tribal authorities, the indirect rulers of colonial and apartheid rule, and subjects of white landowners with no civic rights. Under apartheid, attempts were made to restrict labor tenancy through the creation of labor tenant boards, but white landowners who sat on the boards resisted these restrictions because it was in their interest to retain the status quo. Ultimately, capitalist development retained neo-feudal forms of labor exploitation and was characterized by capital substitution as opposed to outright mechanization, while suppressing the emergence and potential of black agricultural petty commodity production. So the appointment of the Special Mastery of Labor Tenancy in 2020 came against the backdrop of a land claim of 4 labor tenants in Hilton College. As we know, Hilton College is probably the most expensive private school in South Africa. And in 2022, the fee for one pupil was 343,000 Rand. It was established in 1872 and is now situated on a 1,762 hectare estate that includes a 550 hectare Nature Reserve. The original farm on which the school is located was settled by voortrekkers who called it ongegund, which translates as ungranted. It was renamed Hilton by Joseph Henderson in 1857, having purchased the farm from Johanna Grobelaar in 1849. The school's website boasts that half of its headmasters have been Cambridge graduates and that a strong military tradition was formed from the start, with the Hilton College Guard being the first school mounted unit in the British Empire. So that's the one historical account. Let's look at the people from Hilton College and what they say. Rosemary Mwelase is a descendant of Chief Mbewu Mwelase, upon whose land the school was built. She described the events. I grew up here and witnessed my parents working hard on this farm. During their times, they seemed unaware of their oppression. But since I was younger, what I saw was that they lived under oppression because they had no voice. I remember very well them teaching us our history on the farm. My fathers lived in the Umgeni River Valley, and there came a white man called Lucas, who had been allocated a piece of land on which the school would be constructed. At the valley, he met our great-grandfather Mbewu and announced that he had purchased a piece of land at the top of the valley and requested my great-grandfather to organize people who would be recruited to construct the school. Mbewu then proceeded as instructed and recruited people who would construct the school. The construction of the school then proceeded. The foundations of the school buildings were dug with the aid of cattle from our homesteads. These cattle were owned by our great-grandfathers. My father's name was Klegwana. This was not his birth name. He was nicknamed by the landowner on the basis of his bodily physical appearance, which was smaller than the average. The landowner asked how would Klegwana, old man like, cope with construction work on the farm. My father never lived a free life. He was the firstborn and thus forced to work on the farm. That is why he started working on the farm in order to help out the family, since it was a very large family. He thus grew up working here at Hilton College and never worked anywhere else. He worked till old age. He aged on the job here at Hilton College. As one of the oldest people at the time who had witnessed the arrival of white landlords, he was oppressed and had no voice. Even he had wished to speak out. He was oppressed and unable to speak. These are the things I noticed as hardships they experience. My father and his generation saw the exchange of landlords. Since every landlord that would arrive would find them living on the farm. However, they had no power over their landlords. It was the white landlords that wielded the power over them, regardless of the fact that they were found occupying the land prior to the arrival of white landlords. And then, since the banks of the Umgeni River was their place of residency, far from the workplace by Hilton College, they were relocated closer to Hilton College premises. And then they were relocated again for the same purposes. So black South Africans lost their land through colonial conquest and the establishment of a legal regime based on private property, which is the first clause of Section 25 of the Constitution. It protects it. The four colonies or republics that were the forerunners of a unified Union of South Africa, they also created a similar regime. But capitalist development as a whole received a major stimulus through the discovery of rich deposits of diamonds and later gold in the final third of the 19th century. That created an internal market for agricultural production to expand rapidly. And the social relations of production that evolved under these conditions saw white landowners exploiting, as they evolved their capitalist agriculture production units, exploiting the laborers as if they were still in a slave era or a semi-slave era. So payment in kind, access to land for cattle, access to land for cropping, that constituted the payment of labor tenants. As time unfolded, yes, they achieved a pittance wage, but they continued to be tied to the land through those kinds of relationships whereby it was the access to land in exchange for labor that allowed them, or forced them, in a sense, to work. But they had to take a calculated decision, which they did, in order to decide, okay, we will provide labor because that's the only way we can access land. It's important to say that this contract has been very, very eloquently described as it arises out of Roman Dutch law by the former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke in a landmark judgment on Goedgelegen Farm, because the actual applicants, it was restitution, the actual applicants were labor tenants, but they applied through the Restitution Act. And he said, at its very core, labor tenancy under the common law arises from a so-called innominate contract between the landowner and the labor tenant, requiring the tenant to render services to the owner in return for the right to occupy a piece of land, graze cattle, and raise crops. In the name, it is an individualized transaction that requires a specific performance from the contracting parties. This means that labor tenancy does not sit well with commonly held occupancy rights. It is a transaction between two individuals rather than one between the landlord and a community of labor tenants. It must, however, be recognized that despite the fiction of a common law in regard to the consensual nature of labor tenancy, on all accounts, the labor tenancy relationships in apartheid South Africa were coercive and amounted to a thinly veiled artifice to garner free labor. So this has been understood by other scholars of the development of agriculture like Mike Morris, and he has indicated that in the absence of that access to land, many left. They would rather take their stock and leave and go and look for another farm where they would, in Siswati Gukonta, in isiZulu ukukhonza, because that is the word to name labor tenants. Abakhonzi basemaplazini, abakhonti basemaplazini. So they would rather go and find someone who would give them that land if a landlord tried to squeeze them off the land. So we had two forms of indirect rule in the countryside, because everywhere in Africa, as we know, there was indirect rule, where the colonial power would use indigenous rulers to rule native subjects. But on white farms, they were subject to the rule of a boer. And that's the reality. Of course, some of them created an intermediary, induna, to manage the labor force. So obviously the strong support of these white farmers was used by the colonial and later apartheid state to control the black population on white land. And the role of the state was paramount in overseeing the maintenance of the relations in the countryside. And as we know, colonialism and apartheid tied the access to land for black South Africans to the native reserves and Bantustans, disenfranchising them and continuing to move them into those areas. So what we're arguing here today is that labor tenants entered into innominate contracts, unwritten contracts, for access to land for social reproduction through petty commodity production, providing labor to their white landowners as a calculated decision under the objective circumstances of sweeping land dispossession by a white colonizing force. So, civil rights, obviously, or civic rights, were completely sacrificed. Not that those living in the Bantustans enjoyed them, but as we saw in late apartheid, there were attempts to give them, through independent homelands, some modicum of these rights. There was also a massive cattle grab. It wasn't only a land grab, and Tembega Mugaitobi has described it in his book, Land Matters, and even tried to quantify the extent of the cattle grab. So this is the situation at a very high sweep through history, a high-level sweep through history, as we enter the transition to democracy. And the status of property was part of the compromise at CODESA. And Section 25, as we know, protects property rights, just as it creates the opportunity for expropriation of land without compensation. So we'll talk somewhat about that, but then let's push to the most recent land audit done by the Department of Rural Development and Land Reform in 2017. And according to this, African people still owned a mere 4% of the total of land privately owned in South Africa, 4%. Whites owned 72, coloreds 15, Indians 5. So that's what that land audit showed. So what did Section 5 try to do, or 25, sorry, of the Constitution try to do? It tried to address ownership inequality through the nation's commitment to land reform and simultaneously protect private property. And this placed a limitation on the ad hoc expropriation of land outside the general law of application. So we've waited 30 years for an expropriation act, right? And it's still sitting in the presidency right now, the latest version of it. The thing is, these communities I'm talking about already have a general law of application. Surely it would have made more sense to go all out to get a ruling in terms of the Labor Tenant Act and expropriate land with just an equitable compensation that, depending on the circumstances, could have even been no compensation. Instead, we hear billions of rand in cases, in the case of Mhlaba, being expended for the purchase of a farm to enable a restitution settlement where the state's own valuer general put a 450,000 valuation on that land. So, how do we understand the failures of public service reform in relation to this situation where someone who was once a DG of the public service now is appointed to administer on behalf of the courts a program within a department? So across the 20th century, in the late 20th century, there was an influence of a paradigm called New Public Management that sought to draw on the private sector to inspire effective, efficient, and accountable public administration. That's what coincided with the transition to democracy. So we had Section 195 of the Constitution, which describes the values and principles, including meeting people's needs, developmental public administration, and participation in public administration. And those principles apply to every single organ of state. So, what happened with this new public management? Tony Blair was the doyen of this, by the way, in the UK. He contracted consultants to do all his thinking for him. And look what we were left with. Look at the failed privatizations across Europe and the United States. But anyway, the department contracted NGOs to manage the whole claims lodgement process. There was no standardized application form. There was no central database. There were just lists and lists that filtered from these NGOs in different places, depending on their level of compliance in terms of the contracts which they entered into. So we had a mess. NGOs expected how many claims? NGOs expected 500,000 labor tenant claims. Dr. Ngubane even traced the original newspaper article in the Mail and Guardian. It was a bit more modest. 250,000 slaves are freed was the headline when Derek Hanekom introduced the bill to Parliament. Department ended up with a list of 22,000. 22,000 applications. That's what they ended up with. So, what actually happened? What happened, which we'll explain after we give the facts, what happened was that the farming community thought ahead from the start. From the start, they thought ahead. And what happened is eventually there was a measurement done around 2000, early 2000s, and tabled in Parliament by an NGO, Nkuzi Development Association from Polokwane, with the Social Surveys Research Institute in Johannesburg. They did an analysis which I haven't seen challenged. And they compared the 10 years prior to democracy and the 10 years post-democracy. And what did they find? So from 1984 to the end of 1993, 1.8 million black people were displaced from farms, and 737,000 were evicted from farms. 1994 to the end of 2004, 2.3 million people evicted, or displaced. Can be an eviction as well, because of the way it's categorized. 942,000 evicted. So in the whole period of 20 years, 4.2 million people displaced, 1.7 million people evicted, and of those post-apartheid, 0.1% used a legal process. That is what I call the ethnic cleansing of the South African countryside. And I even put that forward as a fact. So in the process of these relocations, as we saw in the first case, the tragic case of Thulani Mkhwanazi, we even did agroecological studies on available data. They were living on prime livestock land, and they ended up on rocks, on a mountainside. They lost most of their cattle. Many of them just fell down those, because in that part of KwaZulu-Natal, when it's rainy and that, there's mists. The cattle just slid down the cliffs to their death. So what have I found? Well, what I found in the aftermath of this is that it's just carried on. It's just carried on. Estimation of 7 million people on historically white-owned land. We don't even have the census doing any figures for us. But probably one can estimate anywhere between 1 and 2 million people. All these people cleansed in the countryside, our country. I see ongoing brutality. I see human rights abuses. I've told you in detail of some of them. And they leveled allegedly against men, women, and children. There are, however, in my estimation, because the claims have taken so long and so many of the original claimants have passed on, they've left widows there. So there's actually a lot of work that we can do intellectually in this university on issues of gender and transformation possibilities in these areas, because the act itself is gender neutral. It never mentions the word man or woman. It never talks about a man as a labor tenant. It just talks about applicants. It talks about their parents and grandparents. And it also allows succession to be done outside estate law. The Act makes a provision for succession outside of estate law. So I think there's a whole lot of potentials there that need to be explored. My principal strategy is to try and win precedent cases, and it's pretty difficult when you have no resources. And the only backup now, because the department gave away its money and capacity, which it had been used for outsourced lawyers, to Legal Aid South Africa. So they're just starting to try and build an internal capacity. And some of the cases that are already there knocking at the court's door, I'm really nervous. I'm really nervous when I look at the ground. Even before I could start today, I got a call from one applicant telling me what his lawyer is saying and doing. It's difficult. It's difficult. But we need these precedent-setting cases. And look at the whole issue of just and equitable compensation. Also lost claims. Because we started with a number of, in the pilot we're doing, 28 farms. There were 450 applicants, but it's rising towards 600. So everywhere there are people who believe they've applied and they didn't apply, according to the records of the department. So there's these complex issues when the cattle slide down the mountainside. How do we deal with that? There's also issues of mining rights, because the Labor Tenant Act says that labor tenants must be treated as owners in terms of the MPRDA. So in terms of the Mineral Resources Act, they are supposed to be treated as owners. But what about the impact on people and even bringing those into judgment? So we held with KwaZulu-Natal Council of Churches a healing of memory session. Okay, and it was, the labor tenants were very skeptical when we started, but as they went through it, they got completely absorbed in it, and that's when one began to see the levels of trauma and healing that is required to strengthen the resolve of labor tenants, subject to years of ethnic cleansing and the accompanying trauma, to carry on in the hope that their land will be returned to them. So one of the issues is obviously the importance of organization. And Nsebeza has documented some. There was a research, sort of a surge of organization at the turn of the century into the 21st century. And this really pointed to a lot of opportunities for labor tenants to organize so that they become more of an active voice in the land claims process. The Landless Peoples Movement was formed, but it did not prove to be resilient. So this is a major area of work that needs to be done. In fact, in the absence of resources, the department was agreeing at a point to allow me to use labor tenants as volunteers in the field research process, to administer questionnaires and to help collect data and information. But when the cost containment came, that door was closed out completely. So basically, we are in a situation where the post-apartheid transition involved serious compromises. They set back the quest for social justice. But something important was gained in return. And that was the whole issue of the dismantling of judicial apartheid and the introduction of majority rule electoral politics at the national and provincial levels in exchange for concessions to white economic privilege. So I've been told that my time is basically up. So I've said a handful, but I just plead for your indulgence for a short poem in Siswati. And my son, Vuma Levine, is a jazz musician. And he wrote a song called Gijima. So I asked him, can I kind of customize your song for my purposes? And he said, go for it. Wena longenhla, ngitsi gijima. Gijim ubigela lo sentence. Gijim ubigela lonke le live. Ngitsi gijima, live liyasha. Gijimani nangumlilo losha buhangu hangu. Spelile sive, uyashumuti, baphela abantu. Umlilo usha buhangu hangu. Umlilo ubusha tikotsa. Lipeli limfuyo, tapela tiganga. Lalela, wena longenhla. Gijima mfana, gijima ntombi, gijimelani emfuleni. Na imithi iphelile, nalulundwe lophela. Washumuthi, lasha live, baphela abantu. Busapasapa yonke indzawo, tikotsa tiphelile. Guyangonga, ngitsi gijimani bafana, gijimani tintombi, tsatsani bantfwana, xoxani gonke le ningakuphatsa ngoba live liyasha, live liphelile, luntfu liyaphela, washumuthi, nangu umlilo losha buhanguhangu, nangu umlilo locheza abantu, nangu umlilo nkosi yami. Bathi bayabaleka kansi ababaleki. Bathi bayabaleka kansi bayawubanga. Nkosi yami. Haw, lalelani. Khulumani nemadloti. Batsini na. Lalelani bo, selitawuduma manje. Bhekani intuthu ihlangana nemafu. Umbani nekudvuma kugcwala isibhakabhaka. Idla imvula, lithulu liyatsela, seliyaphuma ilanga. Bobani laphaya labehlayo, bobani. Bangabakhonti basemaplazini. Aphi emabunu abo, ahleti endlini yabo, adla inyama, anatha tshwala, nabameli babo, nabanye abasebenti bemphakathi. Hawu, baphi bameli babakhonti, nabo bakhona. Gijimani. Sengeve ngabakhonti kutsi kwentakalani. Bahlabalele emadloti ingoma, baphethe makhuba netinhlanyelo, batawuvusa umhlaba losihle, mawubuya umhlaba, mawubuya. Ngiyabonga.
Siyabonga, siyabonga, Prof. Sizabalazela ilizwe, sizabalazela ilizwe, sizabalazela ilizwe, sizabalazela ilizwe labantu abamnyama, ilizwe. Siyabonga, siyabonga. Yaphela imfuyo, taphela tiganga, umlilo wesihangu-hangu, baphethe makhubo. Siyabonga kakhulu, Prof. That was an incredibly detailed, deeply thorough comparison of land reform, not just in Africa, across the world, and where for once redistribution was not a swear word, not a threat when it served the purposes of certain powers. And it reminds me of a bit of an exchange I had with one Helen Zille in the newspaper when she kept saying, we need to be like Singapore. And I said, good, because they had an incredibly radical land reform. So we thank you so much, Prof, and I would hope that we can share this incredibly thorough and well-researched paper. We do have extremely high standards for our students, at least in the humanities, so thank you. No, we pride ourselves. Our humanities students have high, high expectations. For the learners, I wanted to ask you a question just before I introduce our respondents and invite everyone to come and sit up here. When was the first recorded event of an indigenous person going to England, being taken to England? It's not in your history books or what? I'll give you the answer. Now you can't get the prize. The first recorded story of an indigenous man being taken to England, 1613, just after the Elizabethan period. His name was Xora, a Khoi man from the Cape who was abducted and taken by the British East India Company to England in 1613. So it's those histories that you need to understand if we're going to be able to handle the land question. All right, with that, I would like to invite all our guests to come onto the stage, and we'll use the mics that are provided over there. I'm going to introduce our first guest, who has visited us all the way from the University of Witwatersrand, and that is Dr. Dineo Kosana. She's a senior researcher and project leader for the Nature and Society Cluster, coordinates the coal project which investigates South Africa's transition from coal to renewable energy at Society Work and Politics Institute, known as SWAP. Her specific focus on the project is mining-induced dispossession, which is central to rationalizing, amongst other reasons, why the transition from coal is necessary. Yes, it is you, Dr. Dineo. And our second discussant will be Dr. Mhlaba Ngubane, who is in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. He's a senior lecturer here, and his focus is on the impact of land redistribution in the Global South. And his most recent work is that he was part of making a beautiful, amazing film, which was shown yesterday, and it really is. It's funded by the National Research Foundation. It was an amazing piece of art. So I will invite you, Doc, for a 10 to 15-minute response, and then Dr. Mhlaba. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. I feel quite honored to be in the company of prestige, and just to say that in my undergrad years actually, I was reading Prof. Levine's work in sociology at Wits. And so this is a very full circle moment where I actually get to be a discussant, particularly for his wonderful paper and the talk that he has just given us. So with that, I'd like to thank you, but also to thank the university for welcoming us in such a warm manner. It's felt and it's appreciated. I think it's quite important to network in this manner. So this is a moment that I don't take for granted. So without wasting time, I've read the paper and I've listened to the talk, Prof, which I think many of us have enjoyed, right? And I think that in a moment where we're constantly talking about decolonization, I think that's exactly what we mean by you standing in front of us and speaking in Siswati, and you articulating people's experiences in their own language. So that is something that I think we have to appreciate in academia. I think that's what we strive for. I think that's what Fees Must Fall was about. So I think you epitomize exactly that. So I will start by saying that when I read the paper, it spoke to my work quite closely, because at first I was skeptical. When I get invitations to speak, I go through sort of an anxious moment to say, why was I invited, right? But the more I read the work, the more it actually resonated with my area of work, particularly on mining-induced dispossession and questions around land rights, right? And I think what the paper does, which really speak quite, in depth to actually the argument that I make in my own work, is that dispossession is a continuous lived experience in South Africa. So that's the first point. So if you look at South Africa's historiography, for those who are historians, you'd be familiar with that language. You will understand that we associate, or historians have associated, dispossession with the colonial period and the apartheid period. But what Prof has actually just demonstrated to us, and what his paper demonstrates, is that dispossession is actually an ongoing experience for communities, and particularly for labor tenant families who face evictions, right? And I think this is quite important because, you know, when you read the work, for example, of Peter Delius, of historian Peter Delius, if you look at Desmond Cosmas, for example, some of the most amazing historians like Charles van Onselen, and economic historians like Colin Bundy, these are scholars that were articulating and showing us or telling us about the economic experience at the time of dispossession of labor tenants, right? And also, you know, unpacking the system of apartheid for us and how it's connected to capitalism. But we didn't think that these questions and accounts that they're talking about would still be talking about post-1994. So that's quite critical and something to think about that Prof makes in his paper. And I was also thinking, as he was talking and as I was reading, that what he's describing are evictions on private farms. But the accounts or the narratives or what is happening, particularly around the lack of security of tenure on private farms, is also happening on customary land. So for some of you who'd be familiar, for example, with politics on customary land, and for those who know that South Africa is a dual system of governance where we've got a democracy and we've got traditional authority, the accounts or the experiences of the families that he's describing are the very same accounts and experiences of families who live under traditional authority in South Africa. So there is no difference. And the mechanisms of dispossession as well that he describes are exactly what communities go through on tribal land. Now, I also thought it's quite interesting because I would argue that most of these evictions and the numbers have gone up because of extractivism in this country. Because, for example, we rely on coal to generate 80% of South Africa's energy system. And so for us to get that coal, to keep our lights on, people are relocated, including their ancestors, right? Their ancestral graves, to actually generate the country's energy system. And we've seen the relocations, the evictions, not just for coal but also, for example, I'd say in the platinum sector. And so on page 2, there's a quote which Prof writes, and he says, "The land is the central demand of many labor tenant applicants who are now aging and growing, increasingly anxious about prospects of achieving their land rights in their lifetime." And I thought the land is not only important as an economic or a material thing. The land is what affirms citizenship. It provides home and belonging, and it provides a sense of dignity, and it also provides spiritual stability, and I will speak to this towards the end. And I also appreciated, I think in his talk as well as in the paper, how Prof. Levine problematizes South Africa's land reform project. He questions, for example, the model of the willing buyer, willing seller, which was used for acquiring restitution and redistributive land in the program in South Africa, as many of you would know. And as I was listening and as I was reading, I thought to myself, why must we buy back the land? Why must we buy back the land? Is buying the land to restitute and redistribute to those who were dispossessed not a process that pays back or rewards the forefathers of the perpetrators? Does that not reduce South Africa's land reform program to a flawed program of repair? Now, compensating landlords for their crimes is not a project of redress. That is my argument. It's also not an acknowledgement from the perpetrators, neither is it an acknowledgement from the state. And that's my argument. Now, I will not waste time because I know I've got exactly 15 minutes. But I wanted to read you some excerpts which I grapple with in my own work on mining-induced dispossession. So I took a picture because I realized that my laptop won't fit here with this being here. Now, these are excerpts from Solomon Plaatje's work, Native Life. And Solomon Plaatje is writing at the plight of the passing of the Native Land Act. And this is just after the formation of the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, and then we've got this act now passed, and of course the subsequent acts. And he writes, sorry, I'm going to read this. He says, so this is one family that he's reflecting about in his writing. He says, Mrs. Kobadi carried a sick baby when the eviction took place, and she had to transfer her darling from the cottage to the jolting ox wagon in which they left the farm. 2 days out, the little one began to sink as the result of privation and exposure to the road. And the night before we met them, its little soul was released from its earthly bonds. So the baby died, right? And this is after the passing of the Native Land Act, and the family was now moving away or being evicted from the farm. The death of the child added a fresh perplexity to the stricken parents. They had no right or title to the farm lands through which they trekked, They must keep to the public roads, the only places in the country open to the outcasts, if they are possessed of a traveling permit. The deceased child had to be buried, but where, when, and how? So these are critical questions that he's framing, particularly following the evictions. Where would they be buried, when, and how? Now, my final bit of this excerpt. It says, this young wandering family decided to dig a grave under cover of darkness of that night when no one was looking. And in that crude manner, the dead child was interred. So the dead child gets buried in that evening when no one is watching, and interred amid fear and trembling, as well as the throbs of a torturing anguish in a stolen grave. This is quite important, a stolen grave. Lest the proprietor of the sport or any of his servants should surprise them in the act. Even criminals dropping straight from the gallows have an undisputed claim to 6 feet of ground on which to rest their criminal remains. But under the cruel operation of the Natives Land Act, little children whose only crime is that God did not make them white are sometimes denied that right in their ancestral home. So this is a very important quote, and I'll tell you why. He's basically recounting the events after 1913 and saying that the critical question, particularly following the evictions and the loss of land, where do we bury the baby? Now, this is a very important question because it's about rest. And we've heard the elderly, particularly when we conduct research and interviews and get accounts of people and the accounts of labor tenants, they ask the question, "Ngiyolalaphi? Indawo yami yokugcina ikuphi?" And this is an important question, particularly for South Africans with histories of migrancy, where they'll be in Johannesburg, but when they want to be buried, they want to be returned home to a place of rest. Now the question is, without the land, where is one buried? Where is one's home? And where is one returned to? And this is a critical question. And I think it's not simply a material question about the land. It's also a spiritual question. And I think it's a spiritual question which the historiography around dispossession had missed, because the understanding of the land was purely in economic terms, but to not think about how the land actually gives the African person dignity and home and belonging. And so this question that Solomon Plaatje poses just at the passing of the 1913 Land Act is a critical question that's posed to date almost 100 years later. Now my question to all of you is that why is this question posed once more after 1994? Why are African people still posing this question in this very moment? What was the moment about 1994? Right? Was 1994 simply a moment to give people rights to vote? Or was it a moment that just says, well, we cannot restore your dignity? As a result, we're still posing the very same question. And I wanted to share with you, in my experience, for example, of working on the Land Restitution Bill in 2013 for the UCT, Center for Law and Society, which is now LAC. What was interesting, particularly when I monitored the Land Restitution Bill, is that across provinces, although the hearings were about restitution, elderly people stood in front and cried about access to their ancestral graves, for example, most of whom were actually labor tenants, had been evicted, had claimed the land, were waiting for their land claims to be resolved. And they said, we don't have access. When we go to the farms, which we have claimed, we have private farm owners who take out guns and try to shoot us. In that moment, the person is trying to reconnect with their loved one, their father, their grandfather, right? Because we have got those kinds of beliefs. Now, what does it mean when your land is being restituted? You've claimed land A, you receive land B, but you have no access to your forefathers' ancestral graves. Is that a restitutive process? And I think that's what we have to think about in relation to South Africa's land reform project, to say what exactly has been restituted, what is being repaired, and is what's being repaired returned mainly in thinking about economic terms or economic transformation, but not necessarily restoring the dignity that was lost when it was stripped in 1910, for example, and by the 1913 Land Act and the subsequent laws. Now, in closing, I want to also share my experience once more as I was working in Somkele, for example, where communities are being relocated along with their ancestral graves for mining, right? And some of them were labor tenants who had actually experienced the relocations before, during the 1960s, and now experiencing the relocations, including of their ancestral graves because of mining. And when I asked in a full hall with elderly men, women, and a younger generation, and I said, why is the land important to you? What's the meaning of the land? And one elderly man stood and said to me, Mhlaba umbhede wethu. Thina abantu abamnyama silala kuwo. Manje uma amamayini athatha umhlaba wethu, thina abantu abamnyama silale kuphi. Now in English, it means the land is our bed. We African people sleep on this land. So when mining companies, for example, take away our land, where should we African people sleep? And that's a very important question because it speaks about the question of nativehood being born and returned to the land. And to say that so long as people are actually still disputing and grappling over the land, then they don't have the dignity that 1994 as a moment was supposed to have brought. And also what it means is that dispossession or the loss or the evictions that Prof is actually talking about are not simply about the economic aspect of the land, being able to make money of it, right? And just the generational wealth. They're also about the spiritual connection and ties to the land that actually sustain people's dignity. So I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Doc. That brings us really into a holistic view. And yeah, I think we started on a spiritual note for a reason. Just before I invite our own Mandela University colleague, Dr. Ngubane, to come and share some brief reflections before we get to towards the end of our program, I had another question for the learners. How many times did David Stearman escape Robben Island? 7, 12, 3. Yeah, I think it was twice. The third time they were like, no ways, let's take him to Australia. That's how much of a rebel he was. And another quick question. 1790-something, Shaka was being born. Who led the biggest army of resistance in the Eastern Cape at the time that Shaka was not even a person? It was Klaas Stearman. He led the colonizers, 1790s. Okay.
So I've worked with Professor Levine for the past 2 years, and what has been quite bizarre for me is that why are there so few labor tenants advise that perhaps we can talk about the reopening of labor tenant claims, focusing particularly on the Western Cape, Northern Cape, and Eastern Cape. And this is I wish it could be taken seriously, especially in the circles of power within our parliament, but that is highly unlikely. So that is the message that I am giving you, to locate the struggle of the Eastern Cape in terms of land dispossession, the struggles of the Western Cape, the struggles of the Northern Cape. Because in KwaZulu-Natal, in Mpumalanga, there are records of labor tenant claims, but in these regions there are no records of labor tenant claims. Yet, history shows that people were forcibly removed from farms. And if you wanna witness that, just take a drive to Craddock. The land is empty until you reach Craddock. And that is where you see where the people have been forcibly removed to. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ngubane. I have taken that drive to Craddock many times, as you know. And it became very clear that the reason is because of what we did. We said land reform is a 1913 story. That meant descendants of people who are of Khoi, Chwam, Amaqunkwebe, Amaqethe, Amagiqwa, and others are out. So we are facing, no wonder, a challenge from Khoi and San descendants that they've been excluded from the dispensation. So I think we know where the labor tenants are. Hulle is op die plase. I had to learn to speak Afrikaans. Hulle is op die plase. So with that in mind, I want to thank everybody. What we will do now is open for 2 questions before I invite the Executive Dean of the faculty to do our concluding remarks, just because we do have our future leaders here, these young ones, who are going to be the future energy researchers. You will be researching coal, you'll be researching cobalt, you'll be researching all these mining issues. And so I want to thank the young people and give them an opportunity. If they have any questions to ask, it could also be late and we've taken over. It's Katseskim Sam, I don't know. But I think, let me open for 2 questions, and then we will allow the colleagues to do some input, and then we will wrap up our event. So can I just see okay, there's a question there and a question here. So what I will do is I will give the young person the chance, and then we'll move up. Okay, thank you so much. Let me just deal with. There she is over there. Oh, fantastic. Okay, thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Standing before you is Sibusiso Tamana from the institution of Komatlake High School. So my question is, before the democratic country, or rather the economy, yes, people were evicted from their lands. Now, after what is so-called the democratic economy, when the generations of those victims who were forcefully and painfully removed, or rather evicted from their lands, when they want to take back ownership, the Department of Land Affairs will tell you about the process of having to buy land or being given a certain portion of land. Why must individuals have to buy back their lands but we live in a democratic country? Mustn't everyone have equal and full access to their lands? Why do we have private land that certain people cannot evacuate? I thank you.
Thank you so much. At the back there, thank you. There. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Program Director. This university was established 60 years ago. So it's 60 years today. 30 years during apartheid and 30 years of the so-called democracy. So what I want to understand from the university, which role are you playing as a university to transform this society, apart from these shows? Because the difficulty is to come here and be entertained and go back to our cocoons again. Academics, correctly understood, are supposed to have an impact in changing the life of the society, in particular the poor and the working class. So I'm interested to know, I'm also happy and excited for that matter to learn that it's not only leadership or rather academics from this university. You also have the visiting ones. So to cut the long question short is that what is it that the program you have to help transform the society? Remember, this university was established solely for white people in this country. That was the aim of the Nationalist Party, that it will establish a university that will enlighten that part of community, whites only. So hence, I'm asking this question. Maybe going back to your question in sitting down, as to why do we have to buy back the land? We need to respond to that question.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to ask Prof. Levine to make a comment, and then Dr. Skosana.
Okay. Well, obviously, I'm not justifying why the land has to be bought, because as you can see, I've got a lot of problems with what happened. But okay, in CODESA, where, you know, all the key players came together, you know, there was a compromise. And the compromise was, okay, we will give everyone voting rights in a non-racial, non-sexist, democratic South Africa. But in exchange for that, there's going to be economic privileges which are attained. And part of that is private property, because that's what I was trying to explain, is that private property, even globally, the international community supported land reform where there was payment for land. So it was a compromise of the political settlement. But should it be like that? No, it shouldn't be like that. Especially when you hear even the stories I'm telling and the stories I've had to live with every day of my life since I started this work after COVID ended and that the the lockdown was terminated. You know, because obviously it's not just, it's no social justice. So the social justice is what went in that CODESA settlement. That's what went. That's what went. So Mamdani explains it in a way, that was the deal, because the two key players in the deal was the ANC and the National Party. So that's why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission disappointed so many people, including those in Cradock, is because there was never social justice for the atrocities committed under apartheid. So that's the only answer I can give, is that it came out of that settlement. The architects of land reform are the same schools that emerged, as I said, in the post-World War era. There is a table which I had in the longer version of this paper, which obviously I can share that as well, which is, it lists all the countries and the amounts of land. That paper was compiled by someone who came from the World Bank, and he was one of the major influencers of this very story of buying back the land. Part of the compromise. Thank
you. Yeah, that's working.
Well, I think those are important questions, and just to add to what Prof is saying, so the architecture's role of private ownership actually rests in us as a country having inherited Eurocentric law as well, for example. The Roman Dutch property system of law, for example, speaks about absolute ownership
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. That really wraps up our institutional public lecture quite nicely. I could throw one last quiz at the young ones, but I think they're scared of my questions now. The first major battle to be won by indigenous people on South African soil. What was the year? 1510. Who was the king of England at that time? Anaze, no one's teaching history. It was King Henry VIII. That's when the Khoi people were defeating the Portuguese here during the time of King Henry VIII. Right, with that, I would like to welcome our Dean of the Faculty to say her final thank yous.
I won't be long at all. Just a few closing remarks. At the relaunch of the Raymond Mhlaba Center in 2022, our University Chancellor, Dr. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, made an a call to all of us saying, "Asina kuthula umhlaba ubolile." We cannot sit quietly when our land is in shambles. A line borrowed, this line, "Asina kuthula umhlaba ubolile," is borrowed from the poem of one of the little known but commanding imbongikazi yakwaXhosa uNontsizi Mgqwetho from Stutterheim area, who said this at the height of social, political, cultural, and economic upheavals in our country in the 1920s. Today, Professor Richard Levin and his respondents, Dr. Dineo Skosana and Dr. Mngobi Ngobeni, are reminding us of that call in unearthing and addressing matters that concern society's well-being, especially matters that impact those who continue to live in the margins of the human condition. Your engagement today, all three of you, and especially during, or let me say, and also during the master class that you gave this morning to our students, Professor Levin, as well as in the screening of the documentary titled Spirits of the Land, Matonga Elizwe, yesterday. These are a harsh demonstration of ongoing struggle for land reform and justice in our country. And it is through these gatherings such as these that we deepen our understanding, reflect on our history, and to the question at the back, craft solutions as a university and together with all of us here for the future of our country. And these uncomfortable and yet necessary conversations are what sets us apart as a university and as a faculty. I bet in South Africa there's no university. I know this. There's no university where we can talk openly about these issues. So we are committed as a university and the humanities faculty in exploring further how we can contribute to these discussions, and through the collaboration that we have with Prof. Levin and Dr. Mngobi in the School of Governmental and Social Sciences, we're designing a course, a module, which will be taught to our students. And this will involve both academic input or input from theories as well as input from the people who we're engaging with in these conversations. So in this spirit, let me just skip that. Let me then thank guests here. To all our guests here, council members are represented here by the Deputy Chair of Council, Ms. Mpacho, University Senior Management, of course our Acting Vice Chancellor and Deputy Vice Chancellor, Dr. Muki Mueng. I know that there are others that are watching online. We wish to acknowledge them. Our distinguished guests, the Khoi community led today by King Haakon VI, the Raymond Mhlaba family, led by Usisnoma Wethu Mhlaba, Intombi Katata Raymond Mhlaba Sakwamkela, and we also thank you, Sisi, for your presence here. And of course, the speaker representing the family, Utata Umtwabo Ndobo. We thank you for your presence today, when we honored that you could be with us. In closing, I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, as well as the Acting Vice Chancellor and the rest of the leadership of the university, for their commitment in creating these platforms where critical conversations that at times make us uncomfortable are allowed. That can only be enabled by leadership such as this one. So lastly, let me acknowledge those who have contributed in making today's lecture a success, from the organizers under the leadership of the Acting Director of the Raymond Mhlaba Center, Dr. Ongama Mtimka, the administrator, Ms. Nomta Menye, and the rest of the students supporting us in the center. So City, Faculty Makwande, Nangamso. Thank you very much. I have gifts that I would like to present to our guests, and Dr. Mtimka is here. And so if I can invite Professor Levin, Dr. Skosana to accept this. Thank you. Oh, Prophet Kezi, sorry. What's in here? The book is the Mandela book. Oh, wow. Okay. Not yet. Thank you so much. And because everyone here failed my history test, you are all now tasked with homework. The book to read is the book called The Lie of 1652. With that, thank you very much, everybody. Good night.